Everyone, welcome to this week's Fireside Creators. I am your host, Reverend Dr. Sherry Pallas. For this week's show, we are chatting about understanding the death penalty. This is kind of a part 2 of a show we did back in August. And for me, I struggled with the death penalty for most of my life. Within 10 minutes of that previous conversation, my confusion was eliminated and my mind finally made up. I hope you will receive the same clarity tonight. Please remember to keep all comments and questions related to the show topic and that this is a safe space. Thank you for joining us and thank you for inviting us into your home. I am looking forward to all of your comments and questions. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe. If you're on Facebook, grant StreamYard access so we can see your name when you have a comment or a question. Let's give a huge shout out for as little as $3 a month. Thank you in advance. And again, thank you for welcoming us into your home and joining this conversation. I appreciate you all. Okay, let's meet our guests and get smarter. Abraham Bonowitz is the executive director and co-founder of deathpenaltyaction.org. He has been working to stop executions and free innocent people for more than 30 years. Welcome back, Abe.
Greetings. Glad to be here with you.
So glad that you're back. Next, we have my good friend, Paula Barr Skillicorn. She was a career journalist covering crime, courts, and government. She's contributed to several anthologies and is currently finishing a memoir about capital punishment with her late husband, Dennis. The state of Missouri admitted that Dennis killed no one, but they executed him in 2009, several years before the actual killer. An avid abolitionist, Paula helped found 2 state restorative justice coalitions. She presented at the First World Congress against the death penalty at the Council of Europe in France, and she and Dennis spoke at the Second Council in Canada. She continues to help with clemency petitions. Welcome, Paula.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Sherry. And it's an honor to be with Abe, who is like the #1 abolitionist in my book. So I'm honored to share the stage with you.
Well, I am honored to have the both of you on to talk about this. And like I said in my intro, before the last show in August, I was so torn with the death penalty. I brought up murderers, Jeffrey Dahmer and stuff like that deserved it. And Abe totally put me in my place. And within 10 minutes, I was like, wow, okay, I no longer believe in the death penalty. So Abe, I want you to start us off with some of the facts and figures that we have that shows that, I mean, we are supposed to be a republic based on laws and that the law sees everyone, but that's not the case with the death penalty. Can you tell me why?
Okay, well, first, I just want to say I didn't have to put you in your place. I just have to share with my own experience because I used to support the death penalty. And it was in trying to prove to all the anti-death penalty people that it worked that I realized that it doesn't work. And I had to change my mind. And then doing the work, getting involved in cases, because then I was saying, well, let's make sure it's fair and make sure we always get it right. And all of those things. And it was in doing the work that I then met people like Paula and others, people who are murder victim family members, part of the Journey of Hope from Violence to Healing, which is an organization led by murder victim family members and the families of people on death row, and even people who are former executioners who have retired from their jobs in the departments of corrections and then joined our movement to abolish the death penalty. It's meeting people like that I came to understand the collateral damage of the death penalty and how it's not just a public policy failure, but a moral failure. And that doesn't change the fact that there are people who've done terrible things who get to be held accountable. We get to hold people accountable, and some people who should never be free, as they presently are. But we don't have to have executions. And in fact, in the vast majority of cases where they're even death eligible, we don't execute them. We sometimes don't even try to execute them. And all that has more to do with the geography of county lines and the budget of county prosecutors. If you're, and that's what changed my mind, made me jump from one side of the fence to the other, that what matters more is where the crime occurs, whether that's a county that can afford a death penalty trial. 2% of the counties in the whole country account for the vast majority of death sentences and executions. And only five states had any executions in this current year, 2023. So why aren't we using the death penalty a lot more? Why is it only limited to these few states? The reason is because people have become, well, it's become too difficult. It's become too costly. It's become just not even worth it, to the point where we even have prosecutors saying, there's a prosecutor that just testified at a hearing in Oklahoma in October who is still seeking the death penalty, still wants to have it carried out, but he has counseled his own family, his wife, and said, if I'm murdered, I don't want you to go for the death penalty because I don't want you to have to wait decades for the person to possibly get executed, putting your healing process on hold. Another prosecutor I know of in Lucas County, Ohio, Toledo, also said she's stopping seeking the death penalty because she doesn't want the victim family members to have to put their healing process on hold. There's no way we're going to speed it up, because if we try to speed it up, then we're going to make even more mistakes than we already did. We've released and exonerated 195 people off of death rows, and those are the ones that we know about. And the other thing, and then I'll stop, is, just this year, this is one of the difficulties and one of the reasons why even pro-death penalty people take a pause when they think about this, and if they come to understand how it's actually failing us and not functioning. Even if you have evidence of innocence or evidence of malfeasance, for example, one of the people we executed earlier this year, it turns out that the jury foreperson in his case was an out loud racist, and that evidence came up later after his conviction. And because of the procedural bars that happen once you get past certain points in the appeals process, and then you discover new evidence, whether it's evidence of innocence or malfeasance or mental illness or whatever it is, you can't bring it. The U.S. Supreme Court has said over and over and again, we're not going to entertain that. Go ahead and kill him.
Wow. And we're supposed to be a pro-life country.
Yeah. And just last week, here's a guy that everybody acknowledges. He acted in self-defense. They were trying to put him in a cage so they could kill him, and he wrestled the gun away from the people that were trying to do that to him and shot them, and he was executed for that self-defense. This is what's, I just put up a video of the pro-death penalty Republican cowboy hat wearing rancher legislator in Oklahoma talking about these issues and how it's of deep concern to him. If we're going to have a death penalty, let's make sure that it's actually fair and accurate. And, setting aside the fact that there are people who, again, deserve to be held accountable and we deserve to be saved from them, but we can do that, and we do that in the vast majority of cases without executions.
Well, and most of the world does it too, right? I mean, civilized nations.
The vast majority of the countries in the world do not use the death penalty anymore. Those that do, you can guess who they are. China, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Iran,
Russia,
and us. I don't think Russia has the death penalty anymore. They were talking about bringing it back for Ukrainian soldiers.
Wow.
Obviously, there's a lot of countries have what I would call extrajudicial executions, so not going through the court system. But in terms of judicial executions, even Russia, that's one of the things I used to get up and say, I'll work against the death penalty in Russia and South Africa, but not in the United States because we have the best justice system in the world. Well, guess what? Russia and South Africa abolished the death penalty. We still have it.
Paula, my friend, you have such a unique story. Tell us your story.
Well, I was a reporter and I covered crime in courts. And like you guys, I thought justice system works. The death penalty is only given to people who there's no hope for, that they're so completely evil, they can't change. And then I decided, I was getting burnt out on reporting, and I decided to move. And I thought, well, how am I going to support myself? I wanted to do a book on one of my murder stories. And the serial killer was kind of tied up in court, and I couldn't get to that. And another one wasn't done. And I thought, well, I'll do this Good Samaritan killers, because it was a story that I had covered with a coworker, and it broke nationally. And I ended up covering the trial of the person who did not kill, but he went first. And so he was found guilty and sentenced to be executed, even though the state in the courtroom admitted he'd never killed anyone. But he was the first to go, and they needed some justice. And so the killer was actually finally sentenced later, and the third young man got a life sentence. And so I decided to do this book, ended up meeting with two of the co-defendants, and began to really dig into that story. And I still was kind of convinced the death penalty would, that this worked, until I started looking behind the scenes at the things that the reporters weren't given, and pulling the case and seeing all the problems that were going on. Long story short, I ended up falling in love and marrying Dennis Skillicorn, who was not the shooter, but he'd been a drug user and he looked like the poster boy for people you should put to death. Even when we first got married, I was like, the abolitionists have all these little things they're saying, it's more expensive, it's not a deterrent, blah, blah. I'm like, well, I looked into those, and every single one of them was right. I got to know a lot of guys under death sentences in Missouri, and, not one of them ever thought, well, should I do this? I might be put to death. That's not how a criminal thinks.
No.
That's how a non-criminal thinks, a legislator thinks, right? And looking at Dennis's case and all the hoopla they did just because they wanted to get a death sentence, when both of those guys had offered to take a plea, and they for life without parole, never get out again, end of story. And the prosecutor, who initially went after the death penalty, lost the election, but the next guy decided to stay with it. They could have saved themselves a lot of money. So anyways, through the years, knowing Dennis and continuing, it was a real big part of his case. But also I looked into cases of a lot of Missouri fellas. And in Missouri at the time, we had only men on death row. They've killed most of them. We have only 18 left. And just saw case after case after case where prosecutors had lied or manipulated the truth or kept it out of court. And just, I finally could not justify the death penalty at all anymore, especially when we started seeing all these innocent people. So I kind of lived under that cloud of capital punishment. So Abe and I have had very different experiences, but I think we share the same passion. We know a lot of the same information.
Other than Abe, of course, helping me, but my previous education was from John Grisham. I say, regretfully, but, and then reading his books about how unsecure our justice system is, how biased it is, how, I just finished the show Billions, and I'm sick to death about our country and that this is a possibility that it's run this unethically. But to claim that we are pro-life and then so just dismissively and regularly put people to death without any forgiveness, without any restorative justice. I just can't get my head around anymore. I mean, honestly, I got this shirt from Abe at Wild Goose, and I couldn't wear it on the last show. So, but I'm wearing it now that says "Don't kill for me," because I mean, we are literally killing people, and we're not even sure if they're criminals. And then to say that we are a Christian nation and that we're not able to forgive these sins, or or all of these things, it's just so hypocritical. It's just so contradictory. And then we're just killing people for the fun of it. Almost, it's just disgusting.
One thing that really bothers me.
Abe?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Paula.
Yeah, one thing that really bothers me. We have. I looked up today the latest figures I could find. We have more than 200,000 people serving life in prison. That's a parolable sentence. A lot of that is for murder. Approximately 56,000 people in life without parole, which means they're never going to get out, which is, at least in Missouri and most places, it is another first-degree murder charge. For the same exact charge as these folks are getting, we have 2,333 people who have a death sentence. And the prosecutors tell the families, you can't get closure, you won't be vindicated unless we kill the perpetrator. Well, what does that say to the other 256,000 families? That their loved one isn't as important? That they have to settle for life without parole? That makes no sense to me. These crimes are not the most heinous, as Abe can tell you. They're white victims, primarily white victims. They're largely people of color who are sentenced to death, or poor, who can't afford a decent lawyer. I don't mean to be condescending on that, but and as he said, it depends on where this happens. So I guess my question to those people who still support the death penalty is, why are those 2,333 people more important than everyone else's loved one who's been murdered? I'd like you to answer that, right? Because I don't see that it's any different.
Yeah, I mean, the lack of fairness and equality is what got me. It was like, wait a minute, this isn't universal in our country. It's a different zip code. Abe, when we started the show today, I had a banner about someone when you were on in August, and I asked you about it, if it was still a viable link, and that person was executed.
You're talking about Anthony Sanchez, who was executed in Oklahoma in September, despite the fact that there were real doubts about his case. He's one of those people I was talking about. The courts just would not even look at the evidence. And yet we had, number one, faulty DNA examinations, some real questions about contamination in the DNA and how it was gathered in the first place, and whether it was accurate at all. There's Nadia Casares is watching. Hi, Nadia. She is a relative of Melissa Lucio, who was almost executed a year and a half ago in Texas. Another case where there was no crime. You can watch the film, The State of Texas versus Melissa, an award-winning film. You can watch it on Hulu and many other platforms, and we'll tell you the story. So I met Nadia when I was down there organizing to help stop that execution. There was a film about that. We made a film about Anthony Sanchez, which you can find on our YouTube channel, deathpenaltyaction.org. Just scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll find the YouTube channel. And basically we had a whole other viable suspect, and all we wanted was for the state to reinvestigate, with the idea that other viable suspect might have been the killer, put his DNA into CODIS, and we hired an investigator to look into this, and we hired the state's guy. This is a guy that works for the state all the time, and he staked his career on speaking out. And of course, they went ahead and executed him because there's no way to get these cases heard. I do want to double back.
Is that a double jeopardy thing? I mean, why, or is it just a refusal?
Don't say that again.
is it a double jeopardy thing, or is it just an blatant?
No. Double jeopardy is what you can't be tried for the same crime twice,
Yeah.
right? But it's what it is that once your conviction is done, then you get a set of appeals. But if the early attorneys in your case doing your appeals fail to bring issues forward, then, or if they bring them forward and they're denied because the case wasn't strong enough at that point, then you can't raise that issue again. Okay. Now I should say I'm not an attorney, and so I shouldn't, double check everything I'm saying, except that in this case, in Anthony Sanchez's case, and so many others, it really doesn't matter. It's next to impossible. It takes an act of God, a miracle, in some ways, to bring new evidence into a case after it's gotten past a certain point. And the problem is, as was the case in Anthony Sanchez, it was a year ago at this time that Anthony's stepmother came forward and said, my husband, who had killed himself, Anthony's father, had confessed multiple times to her. He was an abuser, and he would threaten her, if you don't do what I want you to do, I will do to you what I did to her. Over and he repeated that several times, and we collected DNA from him. And all we wanted them to do was put his DNA into CODIS, into the database of DNA that law enforcement uses, because he was probably part of other crimes. But now hopefully it's still possible to do that and find out if we executed the wrong guy. So Anthony Sanchez was executed in September. We've had executions in 5 states this year: Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, Missouri, and Florida. So as we speak, I think they're lining up for another Republican presidential candidate debate in Tuscaloosa tonight. One of the people that's a candidate in tonight's debate is Ron DeSantis, he's had 6 executions this year, just trying to catch up to Donald Trump so he can dismiss that I'm tougher than you are kind of attitude that Donald Trump had. But
Trump had a flurry at the end, right? Started executing a bunch of people.
Donald Trump became the most executing president in this country since Roosevelt. Roosevelt had 16 executions over 13 years. Trump had 13 executions over 6 months. Okay. And the funny thing is, not funny, but, after the first one, Daniel Lee was executed in July of 2020, in the middle of the presidential campaign, right? Donald Trump came out to the Rose Garden the next morning, and he made a statement about some other thing, but also mentioned a sentence or two that he had just had carried out this execution. And the campaign had sent out an email to the campaign list saying Joe Biden needs to say why he wouldn't have executed the guy that Donald Trump just executed. And that's the last time we heard from the campaign or from Donald Trump the words the death penalty or executions, even though there were another 12 executions throughout the rest of that campaign. Donald Trump never mentioned it. And why? I think it's because even his base doesn't really support the idea of the government being able to execute people. They hammer on it because there's this tiny percentage, and it probably helps a little bit in the primaries. But evangelicals, Christians of all kinds of people that are conservatives especially, recognize that the death penalty is a failed government program. What other program would we allow to continue to waste all kinds of resources on when we can see that it fails us right now? For every execution, every 8.4 executions we've had, we've released an innocent person off of death row. If planes crashed, 1 out of every 8 or 9, people would stop flying. But we're willing to trust the government with this.
Well, we're also willing to trust everyone with guns, high-powered weaponry. So
I do want to quickly just back up to something that Paula was talking about, because it's an important frame when we talk about who do we seek the death penalty for, and the fact that 99% of the people that are death eligible, meaning that their crimes are theoretically punishable by death, 99% of the time they don't get a death sentence. And it's true what we're saying to the vast majority of victim families in these cases. Your loved one wasn't worth us spending the resources and getting it. But the other thing that turned that around is we're actually sentencing them to decades of putting their healing process on hold. And even in most cases, yanking the rug out from under them, even in the last day, even in the last minutes sometimes. There was an execution that happened in Ohio of a guy that was, he was so old and sick by the time they got around to executing him, but the prosecutor was dead set that he'd be executed. But they knew, because of his age and his ailments, one lung had already been removed, and the doctors had checked it. They couldn't find a vein. They knew there wasn't going to be a vein, but they dragged the victim families down there in the witness room. They brought him in, and they tried to poke him 3 times, and then they gave up because they knew they were not going to be able to establish an IV. And now we've seen similar things happen, horrifically in Alabama. They had an execution last summer. Joe James Jr., they spent almost 3 hours poking and prodding and cutting him down to establish an IV. And then, we knew that he had a last sentence, a final statement ready. But when they brought the media in and opened the curtains to the witness room, he was already unconscious. They had already begun the flow because they didn't want him to say, hey, they just butchered me. And a follow-up autopsy showed that they had literally cut him down and tortured him for hours trying to get that set. And then the next 2 executions, they actually ran out of time. They poked and they prodded and they stuck these guys, and it got past 11 p.m. and the death warrant was going to expire at midnight, and they had to give up. And 2 guys in a row were sent back to their cells after being on the execution gurney, ready to be killed. They sent them back. Think about that trauma for a minute.
Oh, huge.
One of those guys is Kenny Smith. You can pop up that link if you want. Kenneth Smith AL, with the bit.lys. It's case sensitive. But he's the next guy scheduled to be executed in this country, and they're going to try a different way. They're going to try nitrogen hypoxia to be the first attempt to use nitrogen gas to smother a prisoner to death. We're calling it the gas chamber. That's what it is. And that's scheduled for January 25th. And that's a guy we've already tried to execute him. We've already had him in the death chamber, poked and prodded him for hours. And now maybe we'll see what happens. There's going to be litigation. But we invite people to sign the petition. That's what we do at Death Penalty Action, is we give people tools to help us shine a spotlight on the death penalty and give people a way to express themselves and then come together around executions. We do a live virtual vigil in conjunction with the actual on-the-ground vigils outside the prisons or the governor's mansions or the state capitals, wherever the protests are in a given state. And we bring people from around the world together in conjunction with the live protests by a virtual vigil. You can see these on our Facebook page and our YouTube page. It's actually been a pretty powerful experience for people to be able to stand witness virtually. One of the silver linings out of the pandemic thing we created. So it's awful. It's awful. And
it's so uncivilized. We're supposed to be the greatest country on earth, and it's so uncivilized. It's barbaric. And again, it's just so hypocritical being called a Christian nation and then giving our people the death penalty like Jesus. It's just... Okay, let's take a quick break. I want to give a shout out to everybody who's watching. Beth Ann, I got your question. Mike Zeusman, Melissa, Nadia, Shelley, and I think that's it. Okay, Beth Ann has a question. Granted that our prison system is run with the overall understanding that its purpose is penalty rather than reform, and also that many believe life in prison to be an inhumane sentence, where does public safety figure into your belief systems?
Well, thank you for that question. Paula, you want to go first?
Well, unlike many of my fellow abolitionists, I believe life without parole is warranted in some cases when people have are unwilling to change their lives. I've met many men who committed murder who had changed their lives, who I would not fear living next to me.
Mm-hmm.
But granted, I've also met a lot who I don't ever want out in society. And as far as public safety goes, I am no safer or less safe when there's an execution than I am when you instead incarcerate that person. Most of the states, as far as I know, have at least a level 5 institution. In Missouri, they're surrounded by death gates, you know. But beyond that, what I think people don't realize, and here, you know, as a family member, I'm often accused of being less than rational on this. But there are a lot of people on death row in Missouri who actually ran the hospice, who did all the restorative justice, who ran the 4-H life program. Those were, a great many of them were under a death sentence. People do change their lives in there.
Mm-hmm.
And if they, you know, I was no safer the day after they killed my husband than I was the day before, and nor was anyone else. You know, he was behind bars. He would have been happy with life without parole. He was doing really good things in there. And none of the men that I met do I feel safer now that they've been executed. I think it's a false premise that people want to hype up in order to keep the death penalty, that these people are the worst of the worst. And a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are your sons, your neighbors, your daughters, your friends who have been in a bad situation, who've been stupidly on drugs or caught up in passion and wasn't thinking. Very, very, very few of the folks that we see on TV represent really who's in our prisons.
And I mean, like we said, a lot of them are innocent. I actually have, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. My brother-in-law killed his wife. It happened before I had met my ex-husband. So I've actually never met him. We are friends on Facebook now, but he was in prison during my whole marriage and all of that. He didn't receive the death penalty because it happened in California. He has restored himself. He is a productive citizen. I think about my childhood and my teenage years, and it's really a matter of who was caught, not who necessarily are the criminals, because not all criminals are caught. So we are killing people who were caught also, right? I mean, I remember my son being in a traffic court and him saying to me, these are all the people who just had a really bad night. So when there isn't any true justice, when it's variable according to your address, that in itself is a flaw that cannot be overlooked. It cannot be dismissed. You know, if you are eligible for death in Alabama, but not in California, then we are not the United States. We're not a Christian nation. I mean, all of this and I feel so stupid that I struggled with this for so many years going, well, you know, these people should, like I had the power to do so. And I think that's what it boils down to, is a lot of egos, a lot of power saying we can, so we will.
Sherry, you shouldn't feel stupid. The only dumb question is the one that you don't ask.
True. Right? But I mean, I'm in my 50s, and it took all of this time for me to finally go, okay, it's wrong.
I was that way too. Something has to happen to make you start to actually examine the issue and to find the facts, find what's actually true. I do want to say, you know, your ex-brother-in-law, is that right?
Yeah.
You know, he did not get a death sentence because it was in California. California has the biggest death row in the country. 700 people waiting to be executed in California. But they have a Governor Newsom, who in a very statesman-like way, upon taking office as governor in the beginning of his first term, actually ordered the dismantling of the execution chamber at San Quentin and sent out pictures of, you know, the chamber being dismantled and hauled away, and declared that there would be no executions on his watch. And then he just got reelected, so it didn't hurt him either. And and very shrewdly, what he did is he reprieved everybody. He couldn't, if he had commuted all the death sentences, then it would have been challengeable. But because he just reprieved them, meaning putting any death warrants off, there's no challenge to it. And we're going to see what happens when his term comes to an end and who's going to be the next governor of California. And is there going to be a way maybe to legislatively repeal the death penalty in California? They've had 2 referendums in 2012 and 2016. And in 2016, it was just a couple points of difference. And if they had a couple more $1 million, that's why you don't want to have a referendum, because you got to have the money to pay to educate the voters. But I want to go back and
let me just say that is shocking to me, because I have thought all along that's why Manson wasn't.
No, Manson was on. He had a death sentence. Okay, but in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down all the death penalty laws in a case called Furman versus Georgia. They ruled that the death penalty was being applied in an arbitrary and capricious way. It's fascinating if you read the each of the 5 Supreme Court justices that ruled to strike down the death penalty laws wrote their own opinion, which is kind of rare in Supreme Court opinions. But so in 72 at the Furman decision, they struck down all the death penalty laws, and then states that wanted to have a death penalty had to write new laws, many of which did. We ended up having 38 states at one point had the death penalty, and the new laws were upheld in 1976 with the Gregg decision. And that allowed the resumption of executions, which started right away almost in January 17th of 1977. You had the execution of Gary Gilmore for his murder of Ben Bushnell and Max Jensen. And then it slowly moved to a place where we had in 1998 or 98 executions. That was the peak. If you go to deathpenaltyinfo.org, deathpenaltyinfo.org, the Death Penalty Information Center, you can see all the data. You can read their brand new year-end report that looks at all the facts and figures from this past year. In any case, there's lots of people that were on death row, and that Furman decision took about 600 people off of death row and changed their sentence to whatever the maximum was at that time in 1972. And at that time, a life sentence was, you could get paroled after a period of time. One person, a friend of mine I like to talk about, is Rudy Alexander. He was 17 when he murdered somebody. He was on Georgia's death row, and he eventually got paroled and pulled himself up, and not too long ago retired after a career as a fully tenured professor of criminology at Ohio State University. This is a guy who committed murder, should have been executed, right? And here he was teaching criminal justice to our kids. But back to the point I was making to answer the question, when we tell a victim's family, wait till we kill the guy and then you'll feel better, but put your healing process on hold for decades. There are the people that we're executing in this country right now have been on death row, some of them 3, even 4 decades. Okay. Last year in 2022, 5 of the people that we executed had to be rolled into the death chamber in wheelchairs because they couldn't walk anymore. Okay. That's who we're executing. So it's actually a sentence of more pain.
Cruel. That's inhumane and cruel. I mean,
if there's a death sentence in your case, what's being asked of you is put your healing process on hold. And you're going to see. We just saw it last week when Phil Hancock was executed in Oklahoma. And regularly, you have the victim families. They get to speak in front of the microphones after the execution, after they witness it, and they say, finally he's gone, and whatever they say. But then, a friend of mine, sadly, has died now. His name is Joe Brewer. I think the murderer was Brewer. It was I'm blanking on his name. It'll come to me. But he waited 18 years to witness the execution of the man who murdered his wife.
Wow.
And then 3 days later, he had a nervous breakdown, and he realized that witnessing that execution did nothing to help him. And he flipped. He changed his mind, and he traveled the country. He traveled in Ohio with us, sharing his story. This was an Ohio case about how the execution that he witnessed ended up making things worse for him. So, that's the kind of thing that we're doing. So as to the question of, I certainly support the fact that there's law enforcement people, and I sometimes am upset, as all of us might be, when we see malfeasance. But most cops are good people. Most prosecutors are good people. They're doing their jobs. And certainly, as Paula said, we get to be safe from dangerous offenders. And I want to flip around. They call it life without the possibility of parole. And that's what the vast majority of capital murderers get. But it's not really life without parole. It's death by incarceration. And if we think about it in that way, it's a death sentence, but we don't have to make that person world famous and a martyr, and everybody remembers his name or her name, but they don't remember the names of the victims. Like, everybody knows who Tim McVeigh is, but how many of us can name even one?
Yeah.
Of the victims of the Murrah building bombing or 9/11 or any of these things? But we all know the names of the killers. And especially in cases of terrorism, situations like that, we're murdering them. Paul Hill, everybody knows how many people know who Paul Hill is? Well, he murdered an abortion clinic doctor in Florida, was executed there. And outside,
which is insane, by the way, trying to stop death and then killing.
Him being on death row gave him a voice. And when he was executed, I was there. Normally at executions in Florida and in most places, they'll put up a little pen with rope to demarcate. Here's where the pro-death penalty people can stand. Here's where the media can stand. Here's where the anti-death penalty people can stand. Except in Paul Hill's case, they had a fourth pen set up some distance away with actual fencing, not just a rope, but fencing for the Paul Hill fans. And they showed up with their pictures of aborted babies and all that sort of thing. And, it's just incredible. And it's unnecessary because, again, it drags the victim families through it again. And it also, creates, and don't get me wrong, because these are human beings. And especially if you look at the work of Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood, for example, who has been he's a friend and a colleague, and we do a lot of work together. And he's been a spiritual advisor in the death chamber with 4 different people so far. Well, this year is done, hopefully, but 4 different people being executed. And the guy, Kenny Smith, that's going to be killed in Alabama, he's his spiritual advisor too. But what Jeff has done, what other spiritual advisors have done, Cantor Zusman, I guess, is watching. He's another one of these people who provides service as a spiritual guide and an advisor to people who are facing execution, is recognize their humanity and give them a way to understand that, the one horrific thing that they did in their life is not their entire existence. And they still have humanity and they still have value as human beings. Especially if they're not mentally ill, they come to a place of remorse. And we saw that with Casey McWhorter, who was just killed in Alabama. We saw that with so many others. They apologize, and they're often productive as prisoners in prison. So we don't need to do this. And
so as you speak, I'm thinking that the death penalty stops any chance at restoration. I'm a big believer in the scales of life, right? It was an Egyptian thing, and they measured the heart against the feather of truth. And what that did for me was say, if I'm still alive, I can still do something good. Yeah. When we give them the death penalty, we remove all of that. We remove any chance to redeem themselves, to become a productive person in society, even if you're imprisoned. Mm-hmm. Like Paula said, I mean, there are people who are teaching 4-H and, all of these things, but we stop that immediately. So, I mean, even that goes against any type of forgiveness and humanity and looking at people for just what they did wrong as opposed to who they are.
Well, like I said, one thing I want to point out that I didn't, because my comments about what the change that I've seen are largely because Missouri, of all places, is, shall I say, progressive when it comes to death Sentenced, yes. The men who were death sentenced pardon me, I can't remember the exact dates, I think in the late 1980s, were in a horrific rat-infested area of Jefferson City Correctional Center. They sued. They won their suit, but they settled for something that what they did was to essentially they can earn their way into general population. So most of the men I knew with death sentences, all the men I knew with death sentences, actually were in the honor dorm, which gave them the most privileges of anyone in that prison, and they had to earn their way up there.
Wow.
So we in Missouri did not keep them in a death row where they were locked down 24/7, and in fact that's how they were allowed to and encouraged to change their lives. They got to go to different classes that kind of helped them look at what they did and why they did it, and what was going on and why that was wrong. They were able to start programs to help children, and I know in Potosi, a lot of their fundraisers that they put on helped the battered women's shelter and those children. So we had an experiment that worked, and there was no reason to kill any of these men because they were functioning, they were paying back society, they were doing their best to restore the harm in however they could by maybe preventing other family from experiencing that. And yet Missouri still likes to kill. And there's no need. They've proven that there's no need for it,
What is the difference? I mean, I know statistically men create more crimes. Well, I'm saying I know, but what are the statistics between the male and female populations on death row? Is it, how does that work? Are we more likely to kill men than women? I mean, I see that, we have Melissa up here, but I mean, how does that work?
It used to be that way, but not so much anymore.
Really?
Well, there's very few women on death row in the country. There's executions of women are not unheard of, but they're very infrequent. It's just, there's a lot of information about that. There's a whole section about that on the Death Penalty Information web center webpage, DPIC, or deathpenaltyinfo.org. There's also the Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide at Cornell that has a focus on women on death row. So that's where I would advise people to take a look at. But, we almost executed Melissa Lucio last year. I've been corresponding with her for a year and a half, and actually just last Friday, the Catholic Prison Ministries in Texas, they were having a conference, and they were able to live stream a mass that was performed for the women. So they did a live stream of a mass from the women's prison in Texas, in Gatesville, Texas, Mountain View unit. And you could see, they didn't show anybody's face, but you could see the back of them. And the startling thing, of course, is that you have at least 3 of the, I think it's 6, maybe 7 women on Texas death row now. At least 3 of them with strong evidence of innocence. They often, it's domestic abuse kind of situation sometimes, or there's so much that could be said about that. That's a whole other program, really, Sherry. I know we're probably winding down soon.
Right? I can't believe it's already almost over. I have so many more questions, so I guess we're going to be doing a part 3 of this.
Sure. And, I think that what we need to do is make sure that we're hearing from more people like Paula, who have experienced this from from knowing people on death row and people in prison, but also there's victim family members, there's death row survivors. There's a group called Witness to Innocence. You can find their webpage, witnesstoinnocence.org, which is the organization of death row survivors who have been exonerated and freed. And so they have their own organization.
And the Innocence Project too.
Well, there's the Innocence Project, but Witness to Innocence specifically is made up of the people who survived death row. survived attempts at execution.
Wow.
Uh, there's Journey of Hope from Violence to Healing, which is led by victim family members who oppose the death penalty. There's the Catholic Mobilizing Network. There's Shane Claiborne. I know you know Shane, and he's written a book called "Executing Grace: How the Death Penalty Killed Jesus and Why It's Killing Us." And we could spend a bunch of time just talking about that. You probably met Kevin Riggs at the Wild Goose Festival. He is a pastor that does a lot of death row ministry in Tennessee. He's writing a book with a man on death row who is actually an ordained minister in Kevin's church. So we're going to be hearing more about that. So there's lots of ways to talk about this issue. We're going to be having a conversation on the 14th with George Hale, who's a reporter in Indiana who covered the federal execution spree. And you'll hear about the death penalty from that perspective of a reporter who witnessed executions. This Friday, we're launching a video. Cantor Zusman, who we talked about a little bit before, did an interview with Sister Helen Prejean, who witnessed, has been with a number of men as they've been executed. And that's a little bit of a different take on an interview with Sister Helen. So I'm going to encourage people to check that out. It'll be on all of our social media. It'll go up on our YouTube channel at 11 a.m. Eastern time on Friday. But in particular, it's a different take on it because it's coming at it from a Jewish angle and a Catholic angle, but also a spiritual angle on the issues that we all share. But it's not your usual anti-death penalty harangue, which is, I think people are going to find it different than what you usually hear. So watch for that. And the other thing that we're getting ready to launch is our Not Another Holiday on Death Row campaign, which we've done now. This will be the third year in a row where we put a spotlight on cases of wrongful conviction, people who are on death row, who are asserting their innocence. And here they are spending another Christmas, another holiday season on death row despite their innocence, because it's not just them. When you're in prison, your family's in prison with you.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to be lifting up those voices and giving people an opportunity. We have a whole piece on our webpage about the impacted communities, people impacted of the death penalty. I want to encourage people to find that. If you click on Take Action, and then there's a drop-down menu, and you'll see impacted communities, and you'll see where we have a guy on our staff, Charles Keith, whose brother was Kevin Keith, came 13 days from execution, in 2010, I think, and he's available to talk with people who are the families of people on death row and also murder victim family members, because he also is a murder victim family member. His brother is innocent. We're still working to get him freed. But within that page, there's also a list of a bunch of different GoFundMes that these people have who are mired in poverty and just trying to keep their heads above water as they work to free their innocent loved ones. So there's so much to find. And I put some links in the chat here on this platform. I don't know if those actually automatically transfer over to the social media, but just find us at deathpenaltyaction.org.
Abe, thank you so much for coming back on.
Of course.
Paula, we are already at the top, and I feel like we haven't talked enough. Again, we're going to have more shows about this. But if you give me your elevator pitch, because I know you know what that is, on being against the death penalty. I mean, if you only had a couple minutes to talk to someone who was in the throes of vengeance, what would you say to them?
We don't trust the government to do a lot of things in our life. Yet we trust them to decide who should and should not be killed. And that is a misplaced trust. And there's plenty of evidence to prove it.
Yeah. That's powerful. Especially in this day and age when there's so many people that say, oh, the government's worthless. But then we give them control over their lives.
Never anyone cares. I remember when the governor of Illinois, and he pardoned or I think he pardoned or gave clemency to several of the death row folks because of the errors that they found. I can't even remember how many it was, but I remember our governor saying, we don't make those mistakes in Missouri. I'm like, yeah, well, I'll tell you what, we've got at least 3 of the innocent people that were convicted. And that was, I mean, I don't know the latest count. And we've killed Larry Griffin, who was clearly innocent. We killed Walter Barton, who very likely was not the killer and was railroaded into that. We've done, and I live in Arizona now, and I'm sure the same thing's going on here.
We can tell you lots of stories about Arizona. You're talking about Governor Ryan in Illinois. He came days away from executing a man, and whose death sentence whose execution was halted for an unrelated reason. And then some students at Northwestern University actually proved that man was innocent. And Governor Ryan was so shocked that somebody he almost executed turned out to be innocent. So he put a pause on all the executions in Illinois. They did a whole study. They came up with, I think, 80 some recommendations for change, and the legislature just rejected all of them. Wouldn't even talk about it. So on his way out of office, on his way to prison himself, but on his way out of office, he commuted. He actually pardoned a couple of people, released them entirely, but he commuted the entire death row on his way out of office. And he did so because the legislature wasn't even willing to discuss the reforms. And we've seen that also in Oklahoma and Ohio, where they've had whole studies to examine the system, bipartisan, pro-death penalty, anti-death penalty people studies, and then the legislatures just won't even talk about it. And we're shifting that. We've abolished the death penalty in New Jersey, New Mexico, Illinois, Connecticut, Maryland, New Hampshire, Colorado, Virginia, and Washington State. And we have legislation to abolish the death penalty right now in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. So, we're winning. It's just going to take some time. And we're grateful.
Do you see any correlation or between the lack of education in a lot of these states and the death penalty? Is there any correlation there?
Well, I think it's the same everywhere. Again, you're talking to people who supported the death penalty. I used to support it because I didn't know anything about it. I went on my gut reaction. But here's the thing I would say, carved into the face of the United States Supreme Court building are 4 words: equal justice under law.
Exactly.
And anybody, if that's the bedrock foundation of our legal system in this country, anybody who has ever encountered the legal system, the criminal system, or the civil system, knows that we do not have equal justice under law. What matters more than anything else is how much money you have in your pocket when you walk into that courthouse, and who you know. Because in so many cases, the decisions are made in the elevator when the judge and the prosecutor and the defense attorney are all riding up together, planning their next golf outing together, and that's where they decide what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that was the catalyst for me. I'm all about justice, but it has to be equal. And it's not. It's really not. Okay, we are at the top of the show. Abe, you have just drowned us in all of this amazing information again. Thank you so much.
It's a privilege to be with you again.
Go ahead.
I said it's a privilege to be with you again, and it was meant to be that we bumped into each other.
Totally.
In Carolina.
Yes. So any final words? And I've got a ton of banners to show for you, but where can people find you?
Paula?
No, that was to you, Abe.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that's on the action.org. And I also encourage you, there's for whom the bells toll campaign, encouraging communities of faith to toll their bells at the time of executions. But go to deathpenaltyaction.org and just poke around, and you'll see there is legislation in Congress to abolish the federal death penalty. We've got a petition to Joe Biden and we're getting ready to launch a campaign on him to have the United States change its vote on the every other year in the United Nations. There's a resolution for a moratorium on executions, and the United States always votes no. And we think that it's time for the United States to vote yes to halt executions. So we're going to prepare for that starting now. This Sunday, December 10th, is International Human Rights Day. And a year from now is when that resolution will come up again in the United Nations. And we're going to just start now to promote asking the president to order the State Department and the Secretary of State to vote yes for a moratorium on executions.
And then you also have your Facebook group. All of this will be in the descriptions on YouTube and is already in the descriptions on Facebook. Abe, thanks again. Paula, I'm so glad you came on and we got to talk.
Yeah, I'm sorry it took me so long, but
it's okay. I can wait for brilliance. It's okay.
Well, you know, Dennis always told everybody, don't start her on the death penalty because she will not shut up. So I think I did pretty good.
You did wonderful. So any final words and where can people find you?
I kind of stay hidden because when you're the family member of a death row inmate, you get lots of negative comments. But I'm on Facebook, and my last words would be that I say to everybody about everything. Don't just believe what you read on Facebook or see in the movies. Please go to the source, go to the people who are doing the actual research and read and learn, and then make your decision.
There you go. Thank you. Yes. Who's the cat?
Oh, this is Katie.
We got Yoster down here on the floor waiting for her walk over there. So,
and my two behind me that have been fighting the whole time. So yes, gotta love the animals. I'm going to send you two backstage and close the show. Thank you so much again.
All right, thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
It says in the Bible that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And throughout the show, I was trying to think of a time where I initiated some vengeance and where it made me happy for more than just a moment. I don't see how hurting someone else could ever make you feel good. If it does, there's therapy for that. But to need to kill someone else out of your pain only begets more pain, only begets more murder. So I really hope that anybody who is still very strong proponent of the death penalty, then you do look into it. Because again, before August, I was pretty much a death penalty person. I couldn't see any way around it, and now I do. And again, vengeance gets you nowhere. I mean, I can chuckle about some things I did, but to hurt someone else because of your pain is never going to get you anywhere. So this needs to be a regular conversation, and it needs to not be so damn hypocritical, because we cannot say we're pro-life and then be killing people on the regular. Let me see how many. Okay, all of you, thank you all for watching so much. It was another great show, and I love learning things from fantastic people. If you like the show, share it and subscribe. Thank you all so much. Next week's show, we are discussing the meaning and history of Hanukkah. It's going to be another one. Great show. Thanks again for watching. Have a wonderful week, and as always, walk in love. Mwah! See you soon.